question is that the motion be agreed to. Grant Robertson.
Speaker, I rise on behalf of the Labor Party to support the motion and support the Reserve Bank getting the funding that it needs because, Mr Speaker, more than ever the Reserve Bank needs this funding because it's having to do the work that the government is failing to do. It's having to effectively run housing policy in New Zealand today because the government has abrogated its responsibilities in that regard. And, Mr Speaker, don't let it be said that this is just opposition parties saying this. What comes before us today is an agreement between the Minister of Finance and the Governor of the Reserve Bank, but it has to be set in the context of recent announcements from the bank, from the Governor himself and from his two deputies, around their urging for the government to do something in the area of housing. It is unprecedented, Mr Speaker, for the Governor and his two deputies to launch wave after wave of urging of the government to do something in housing, to do something about the supply of housing, to do something about managing demand issues. And in speeches by Deputy Governors Grant Spencer and Dr John McDermott, we have seen the bank taking on the role of housing policy advisor for the government, which is an extraordinary position for the Reserve Bank to find itself in, Mr Speaker. When we look at what Grant Spencer said in his speech, he isolated the government's complete failure to manage the question of the supply of housing in Auckland. What we know from the Reserve Bank's visits to the Finance and Expenditure Select Committee, Mr Speaker, is that they recognise the 20,000 house shortfall in terms of what Auckland needs right now, and the failure of the government to create the supply or support the creation of the supply to reach the target of 10,000 houses a year from there, currently reaching around 7,000 in terms of consents. So the bank itself has clearly said to the government, you are not doing enough on housing supply, especially when it comes to Auckland. But then they also went on to say that in terms of demand issues, they were now being forced to act because there was a government that was unable to manage that demand, that had stuck its head in the sand. So, Mr Speaker, I warmly support the idea that the Reserve Bank and the Minister of Finance have reached an agreement on the funding that they need, because that is now needed more than ever if we are actually to have the Reserve Bank fulfil all of the roles that have been left to it. The government has effectively outsourced housing policy to the Reserve Bank because of the complete failure over 7 years to create a sustainable plan for housing in the Auckland region and for housing policy that affects the rest of New Zealand. And never let it be said, Mr Speaker, that this is not an issue that affects people outside of Auckland. It does, because we know that right around New Zealand today, people are paying higher interest rates than they need be because of the government's failure to deal with the Auckland housing crisis. And the Reserve Bank Governor is the person who has been telling us he would like to lower interest rates, but he is unable to do so for fear of pouring petrol on the overheated Auckland housing market. So this failure by the government to deal with the Auckland housing crisis has impacts right across New Zealand, let alone, Mr Speaker, if the Reserve Bank Governor's diplomatic language of a sharp correction, or as most people would know it, the bursting of the Auckland housing bubble were to happen, and then the rest of New Zealand would really understand just how little this government has done and just how dangerous their inaction in the housing area has been. So, Mr Speaker, the Reserve Bank has found itself in a position, as I say, to take on extraordinary measures to tell New Zealanders that the government is failing it on housing and that more needs to be done. When the Reserve Bank Governor came to the Finance and Expenditure Select Committee after his last financial stability report, he highlighted the three significant risks to New Zealand's financial stability, two of which directly relate to this government's policy failures. The first of those, as I've said, is in housing. The second of those is in the risk to New Zealand of the massive decline in value from the dairy sector entering New Zealand. And this, while the government is not directly responsible for the decline, what the government is responsible for is the failure to diversify the economy in the face of what they knew to be a 5-year glut in global dairy prices. So we find ourselves with the dairy auction from this week seeing a 54% drop in the value of those dairy prices over the last year, 28% since February. This is a sector that makes up a third of our exports, and the government sits there on its hands and hopes for the best, hopes that we'll be able to ride out the wave of commodity prices.
Order. This bill is incredibly narrow. The member is wandering a long way away from it, having read it through myself.
That's
I'm
right,
aware
Mr.
of that, and so will the member be, so he should stick to the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And what I am doing is assessing whether or not the funding agreement struck between the Minister of Finance and the Reserve Bank Governor is sufficient in order to meet the tasks that the Reserve Bank has. And as I've indicated to you, Mr. Speaker, I don't believe that, given that the outsourcing of housing policy from the government has gone to the Reserve Bank, that they would certainly need a high level of money. I mean, I see that they are looking at around $49 million for this year in the motion that we're debating, Mr. Speaker, and it is a legitimate question to ask whether that is sufficient when the government has outsourced housing policy and has left New Zealand's financial stability exposed by its failure to diversify the economy. So it is a legitimate question for this House to ask whether or not the Reserve Bank is being funded sufficiently to do its job. And what I would suggest to you, Mr. Speaker, is the longer the government goes on failing to do its job, the more difficult it will get for the Reserve Bank to do the job it is required of it with the funding that is put forward in today's motion, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, if I may move to another matter in this regard, which is that the funding agreement is based around the idea of the policy targets agreement, which is specifically what one of the measures within the funding agreement about is to allow the government to implement, or the Reserve Bank rather, to implement the policy targets agreement. And I want to say, Mr. Speaker, that it is, in my belief, high time for a review of that policy targets agreement and high time for a review of monetary policy in general, which I don't believe is covered under the funding that is proposed in here today. Because we have reached a point, Mr. Speaker, where the policy targets agreement is all but meaningless. We have heard in the Finance and Expenditure Select Committee that we're likely to have 6 years outside of the inflation band that is provided for in the Policy Targets Agreement. And we find ourselves asking, what is the point of such an agreement if we are constantly outside of it? The Reserve Bank Governor himself has said to us that inflation expectations are simply not being met quarter after quarter, year after year. Questions have even been raised whether or not we're measuring the right things when it comes to inflation. And the question for this House is, does the Reserve Bank have the resources in order to be able to assess that? I think it should be funded for a comprehensive overview of monetary policy and of the Policy Targets Agreement. On this side of the House, Mr. Speaker, we continue to believe that while we want independence for the bank provided for by this funding, and while we want to ensure that the bank has a clear focus on price stability and on controlling inflation, if that's all we get the bank to do and it doesn't meet it, then we need to reassess what we're doing. So we want to see an overhaul of monetary policy to ensure that it works for all New Zealanders, that it works for exporters, that it ensures and helps to control the exchange rate, and that, yes, it controls inflation, but not at the expense of the health of the overall economy. Mr. Speaker, I want to raise one last matter which is relevant to me as a local MP, actually, and indeed to the operations of the Reserve Bank. This year, or possibly early next year, will mark the end of the operation of the Reserve Bank's childcare centre, the creche that operates in the building at the beginning of the terrace. And it's with great regret, as the constituency MP, that I note that this has been a service that's been well used by many MPs' children, by the children of public servants, and unfortunately, because actually of some of the things in the funding agreement today around the tasks of the Reserve Bank, that is no longer possible. It is my understanding that an alternative premises may have now been located, and I want to thank the Reserve Bank Governor for his allowance for some extra time for that childcare centre in those premises. But it is with regret that something that has served the people of this city so well, provided for by the Reserve Bank, does not seem possible. But Mr. Speaker, I want to conclude by saying that the Labor Party will vote for this funding agreement. We support a strong, independent Reserve Bank, but we cannot sit on the sidelines and let the government push more and more work onto that bank by failing to have a housing policy that works, by failing to diversify the economy, and by not actually giving the Reserve Bank the kind of policy targets agreement that would enable a monetary policy that actually supports the exporters of New Zealand.